Dina here, littlewidow.com, the Little Widow on Twitter, Littlest Widow on Instagram. So tonight we're going to do one of our little fireside chats, and I'm going to try to talk about a little bit about the basics of astrology. So this is going to be under the groundwork section of the blog, where I just want to kind of have some lessons. I am going to type something up about this. I find it easier to kind of, grasp probably that way, but a lot of the people who've been asking me questions about astrology, I feel like don't really read the sections. I think it's easier for them to watch a video. So that's why I'm doing it this way, even though it's going to be a little messier, I guess. I don't know. It's more off the cuff and I don't know. All right. So I did get a lot of questions actually about astrology though. A lot of people are saying like, what does this mean? How do I read this? What am I looking at? And when I do write my teroscopes, I talk about, and when I talk about things for the new moon and stuff like that, I talk about things like hitting your personal planets or hitting your angles. And a lot of people don't know how to find that. With all of these horoscopes out there and stuff like that, we talk about that all so much, and nobody seems to know how to find that for themselves. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight. So basically, there is a free website that I highly recommend, and it's called astro.com. Go figure, right? Pretty basic. It's Astrodienst. I think it's a German or Swedish website. I don't really know for sure, but they're great. It is free, and if you create an account there, you don't have to, you can use it as a guest, but if you create an account with a login, you can save 100 different birth dates in there. So it's great. You don't have to add your information every time, or your boyfriend or whoever. You can just do it one time and it'll be in there forever. So basically what you want to do is there's a section called extended chart selection. I feel like that's usually the easiest place to go, because you can change today's date in it, so that if you want to look at transits or different dates on progressions and things like that, you're already in the right place to change the date, and you can kind of look into the future with it. So basically what you would do is you would go in there and you would just enter your information. You enter your place of birth. It will auto-correct for daylight savings time once you put your location and the date in, and it'll tell you if it did that or not. And then its default system is one of the unequal house systems, which is what I use. I use all of their default settings actually, and I've looked into it a lot of different ways. I've played with it a lot of different ways. There's a lot of astrologers who use different house systems. Their default is actually my preference, so there's no need to go bananas and change any of that. If you want a little additional information, under additional objects, there's a little tab down the bottom, and it'll let you add Black Moon Lilith, the vertex, the part of fortune, things like that, which we can discuss in more depth in a later chat. But I mean, you certainly don't have to do that. And it's going to basically pop up a wheel that looks a lot like this. I'm going to show you a wheel. It's probably backwards, but basically what it's going to do is it's a circle, right? So a circle is 360 degrees. If we used an equal house system, each of these little pieces of the pie would be 30 degrees. However, our horizon and our orbit of the Earth is not, it isn't purely circular, it's an ellipse. So depending on where you're born and the time of year you're born, the way this is distributed around the horizon is they're not going to be even. They're not going to be equal. And this gives a fairer representation than using an equal house system. It's more important if you live in like England or Iceland or something like that, somewhere near you'll see giant houses if you do a chart for someone like that. And it makes a dramatic difference there. I remember looking at John Lennon's chart once, and his 9th house was gigantic. So that's what you're looking at. And then you'll see, it'll tell you what your ascendant is. It'll tell you your moon. It'll tell you all of your signs. So when I say that, when you hear me say, if this hits an angle, your angles are, you're basically looking at the cusp of the first house and the 10th and 4th house. It's like an axis that runs the cross across your chart. It breaks the circle up, and that's what you're looking at. Your midheaven, which is at the top of your chart, it was the highest point on the horizon when you were born. Your midheaven tends to represent your public persona. It can be your career. Sometimes it can be marriage for a woman, depending, especially if the person that you're with or getting into a relationship with or something is higher profile than you, or if you don't have much of a career to speak of. It can be the father, certainly. And then the point below that, the lowest point in the chart, it'll say IC on it. It's Latin. It's basically your 4th house cusp. I can't even think off the top of my head what IC stands for. Whatever. It's Latin. Anyway, it's the 4th house cusp. The 4th house can represent the mother. It can represent things that are hidden. It can represent the childhood. It almost always represents the home. When something transits the 4th house, you're gonna see something shaken up in your home. Some people also say that it represents end of life. So those can be factors there. Then your 1st and your 7th house. Whenever you hear someone say, read this horoscope not only for your sun sign, but also for your rising sign, which I do. I feel like that's very important. I think a lot of times horoscopes apply more to your rising sign than they do your sun sign. That's your 1st house cusp. So whatever sign was rising on the horizon when you were born, that's what's going to show up on the 1st house. That represents you. That's how the world sees you. That is, some people refer to it as like the mask that you put on. I think of it more as like a filter. So I have a Scorpio rising. I am very pointy and I'm kind of tiny. And I definitely am not very social. Like I go to a party and I kind of just stand there until people come to me. Like I'm very Scorpion in that way. But it also is a veil that you kind of see out of. It does alter your perception a little bit as well. The sign opposite that, the DC, that's the descent. That's the sign that's on the descent. That's your descendant. That's the sign that's setting, basically. That house, the 7th house, represents partnerships. It tends to be the kind of partner that you attract, really, and anything in that house is gonna add to that mix there. So I think the best way that I can describe this as just kind of like a baseline thing for someone who really doesn't have a lot of knowledge about what this means is, I'm a writer, so I kind of was thinking about this earlier. I think that the best way I can describe this is to describe it like a story, okay? So basically, when we're born, our natal chart, right? This is a picture. This is a moment in time. This is what the sky, this is where the planets were, the positions, where everything was relative to, that moment in time. That's the opening scene of a story, okay? So you kind of think of it as like a moving, evolving story of your life. This is the baseline. This is the introduction. The end is written in the beginning, right? So like every good story has a lot of foreshadowing, right? Like think of all of like the ancient, not like the modern crappy stuff. Look at like the things that endure, like the Greek plays, the things that everything is based on now, right? All the classics, there's tons of foreshadowing in the beginning. If you were a good enough sleuth, you could figure out how it was going to end by the opening scene. That's your natal chart. Okay, so essentially, the houses, we talked about the 1st house cusp being your descendant, the 7th house cusp, all of that. They're the rooms, they're the sets. That's where they're the different sets, really, I would say, or location shots if it's a movie. Where the scenes are taking place. This is where the action is happening in whatever house it is. The planets are the characters, basically, right? And the characters it's these archetypal energies that we're working through. Venus is, goddess Venus. It's always going to be love or money, something like that, right? And they're going to look different depending on what sign they're in. So a good way to think about that would be like all the different Pygmalions, right? That damsel in distress is the same. Be she in the original, like George Bernard Shaw version, or if she's, Audrey Hepburn's little squash cabbage leaf in My Fair Lady, or the hooker in Pretty Woman, or like Patrick Dempsey in Can't Buy Me Love. It's all the same. It's all the same character. It's all the same story, but they look very different and they behave very differently. However, it's all the same energy. They just have different cloaks on based on what sign they're in. So Venus is Venus. Venus is gonna operate as Venus, but it's gonna look different, it's gonna come off different, it's gonna have a different energy, it's gonna present itself a little bit differently depending on what sign it's in. Things can be, exalted and be like just such a true, pure representation, or they can be a little debilitated and be a little stuck. Beyond that, there are aspects, which this will show you as well. They're the little lines between the planets. So sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, Mars is square Venus, or Mercury's opposite Uranus, or something like that. The aspects are telling us how and if the planets are going to interact, if those characters are going to have a scene together. And if they have a scene together, if that scene is going to be a point of tension, or if it's going to be a point of release, or like a funny scene. That's how they interact, is based on how many degrees apart they are. So if we have something like Mars and Venus, we might want them square. Like if it's me and my Venus is square, you're Mars and you're a hot dude, I might like that. That's sexual tension, right? That's the leading lady and the leading man, and they're square, there's fireworks. That's tension that we might like. That might be more fun than the trine, right? We might have like a happy aspect, and what we end up with is, you get in the friend territory. Like sometimes squares, they're not always bad, but they're points of tension. And that's what's happening there. And basically we can look at this and we can try to see where we have challenging planets and where we have positive planets. And if those planets are strong and in signs that they're comfortable and able to express themselves freely, and if they're getting support from the other characters, or if they're getting shit from the other characters. And one of the things that we can look at, and we can kind of see off the bat, I always think about, one of my favorite movies is Stranger Than Fiction. And in it, Will Ferrell starts to hear like a third person narration of his life. And so he goes to see this literary professor who's played by Dustin Hoffman. And one of the very first thing Dustin Hoffman says to him, or just about, is the first thing we need to do is figure out if you're in a comedy or a tragedy. Right? And I mean, essentially that's a thing. There's going to be themes. Just because you're in a tragedy doesn't mean that you can't have a lot of fun, that you can't make the best of it, that you can't have as good of a life as somebody in a comedy. A comedy, like sometimes the main character in a comedy is like down and out for most of it. So that's not a, but there are themes. There's a theme that's going to be recurring. So that's the basis of your natal chart. And then what happens as, that's a moment in time. That's a snapshot. So from that moment on, the planets are never going to be in that same position again. Everything keeps moving. Everything keeps changing. So what drives the story forward are transits. That's where the planets are right now, or where they were a year later, or whatever it might be. That's a transit. So when someone says, oh my goodness, like I said yesterday, transiting Uranus was opposite, Venus. It's a transit. So those planets in their position, wherever they are now, they're going to show up in a certain room, in a certain scene. And that's where you're going to feel them, in whatever room they're in. And they're going to aspect these existing relationships and these existing planets. They're going to show up and knock on, Venus's door, and they're going to shake things up, or they're going to do something. And that's what drives the story forward. Those are the pivot points. The major transits, sometimes the stressful ones, but sometimes they can be pleasant, but the major ones, the ones from like outer planets to your personal planets that maybe happen once or twice in a lifetime, or maybe a little more than that, but still, those are the ones that are going to be the most impactful. They're going to be the action scenes, they're going to be the pivot points, they're going to really be what defines that story. And then all the minor ones are going to be the fillers. But without them, nothing would move. Everything would be stagnant. We would just be sitting here looking at these characters kind of milling around. And the theme would never present itself, and nothing would ever be, we'd never learn anything. So that's really how that works. So I would always recommend, whether you're listening to me talk or other people talk, or reading horoscopes or whatever, to have an idea of where your things are and the degrees where your characters are. And so when you see something like next week's moon is going to be at 15 degrees of Sagittarius, if you see that is squaring your Venus and your midheaven, you can expect that to be powerful for you. You know, if you see that, you know, something like Uranus is squaring that, you can expect some kind of shakeup in the arena that is ruled by that Venus and that midheaven. The transits, again, they're the things that cause the change. They are the march of time, and they're what's propelling the action forward. There are things called progressions as well, and if necessary, I can do a whole different talk on them. I mean, there's tons of information about this stuff. They're kind of symbolic. So a secondary progression is based on a day for a year of life. And it is a symbolic thing, but I mean, so much of everything in astrology and tarot, and frankly in life in general, is based on a symbolism. So it's the symbolic movement of the planets. So I would say that, like, when I'm 40, I would look at the chart for 40 days after I was born. If you're in that extended chart selection on Astro, it'll do it for you. You just click down and choose Progress Chart. So that's the same, that shows our development. That's how our character, the girl that we started the story with, that's how she's changed over time. That is how she's taken the lessons and her development, the changes in her personality or even her spiritual nature that happened as a result of these transits, right? All of these action scenes change that girl. She's not the same person we started with. She'll always be that person, but you know, things happened and the story moved forward, and the progress chart shows us how she changed as a result of all of this. And the way predictive astrology tends to work is that if we can see something in the progress chart that shows, wow, look at this, in this period of time, she's gonna be different. Something is gonna make her different. I don't know what it is, but something is gonna change, and her whole perspective is gonna change, like, around this year, because progressions are slow. And then we look at the transits and we say, oh, look at this. Here's where the action's gonna be. Here are the characters involved. Here's the room where it's gonna happen in, right? My house has many mansions. Here's the house this is happening in. We can guess. And that's how we time things, and that's how we anticipate change and things like that. That really is the basis of predictive astrology. We can look at the progress chart and we can say, here's an internal change that's gonna happen. But we know that internal change, it doesn't just happen randomly. It's very rare for a change to happen from within. Usually there needs to be a catalyst from without. The catalyst from without is the transits. If it's something really major, you will usually see that transit it'll usually hit something in the progress chart and your natal chart. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. So basically, I mean, I will do more of these talks, but that's a good way to get started. If you pull this up, you'll see where your moon is, you'll see where your ascendant is, you'll see all of that stuff. And when I post my weekly thing and I give degrees, if you see that it's gonna be aspecting one of your degrees, you can expect to feel whatever it is that I'm talking about. And this is also a great way to get to know yourself a little bit better and to know what you're working with. You can look at your natal chart and you can say, these are all of the archetypal energies, these are all of the natural proclivities that I was born with. This is what I've been given. And then this is how life changed me. And you can look at your progress chart and you can be like, this is where I am now. you know, and you can change the date in that extended chart selection and look at your progress chart from a couple years from now and say, this is where I'm going to be a couple years from now. So that's kind of the basis of it. So I hope that cleared stuff up instead of made it more complicated. I don't know. I know a couple people were asking me for some kind of clarifications. So that was my attempt at it. We'll see. So there'll be more of these, but in the meantime, that's what we have tonight. All right. Good night. Thank you.